Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of the VolunteerMatch Solutions Best Practice Network webinar series. This morning, we're actually going to be sharing some insights from the 2013 VolunteerMatch Client Summit session, In Case of Emergency, Engaging the Community in Disaster Response. My name is Lauren Wagner, and I'm the Business Development Manager here at VolunteerMatch, and I'm going to be helping to facilitate today's session. So before we get started, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping items real quick. We're going to be holding some time at the end of the presentation this morning to pose questions to the presenters. So there are a few different ways that you can ask those questions. The first is by typing the questions into the box on the right-hand side of your screen. And the second is actually through Twitter using the hashtag VMBPN and tweeting those to VM_solutions. So we're going to go ahead and compile all those questions during the presentation, and we'll pose them to the presenters at the end. Also, just so everybody knows, a copy of the slides will be circulated after the session this morning, and that we're also going to be sending a copy of the live recording for you as well. So all the great information you hear today, you will receive as follow-up afterwards. So as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, today's webinar really is very special. Back in May, the speakers that we have on today's call shared their insights on the topic of engaging people in disaster response with the over 125 practitioners, industry experts, and thought leaders that joined us for our annual Client Summit in New York. Over the course of the summit, we heard from close to 30 experts who all shared best practices surrounding the theme of empowering individuals and companies to get engaged in their community. And the session that Stacy, Jim, and James led, and that we're all getting to experience today, definitely got by far the best reviews from all of our attendees and generated a lot of buzz at the event. So we're really excited to have them present as part of the webinar series this morning. I think that kind of throughout the presentation, you'll really hear that theme of empowering engagement come through as we dive into the most recent trends, opportunities, challenges, and solutions for getting people engaged in disaster response and recovery efforts. And we'll be hearing about these things from three unique vantage points. So first, we're going to be hearing about overarching trends from Stacy Cronsall. As the Vice President of Partnerships at Network for Good, Stacy consults with corporations on charity campaigns and disaster giving response, as well as trains nonprofits on effective online marketing and person-to-person fundraising techniques. Next, we're going to dive into the nonprofit perspective and hear about how the American Red Cross engages the community in disaster response from Jim Starr. Jim is the Vice President of Volunteer Management at the American Red Cross and leads the engagement efforts for the organization's over 500,000 volunteers. And lastly, we'll hear from the corporate perspective from James Rooney. James is the manager of the Technology for Good program at Microsoft, where he develops technology solutions that benefit nonprofits. And recently, James was actually recognized with multiple awards for his work on the HealthBridge app, which is an app that connects individuals with friends and family during a disaster to let them know that they're okay or where they are, and then helps to facilitate their ability to get involved with donations or volunteering. So by the end of today's session, we really hope that you walk away with some actionable ideas for how to mobilize the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors and your employees during and after a disaster. So without further ado, I'll stop talking and hand things over to Stacy to kick us off. Good morning, Stacy.
Great, thanks. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, you sound good.
Yes, okay, great, terrific. Well, if you go forward a slide first, I'm thrilled to be here talking to such a great group of people. And like I mentioned, I'm going to run through some overall trends. Before I dive in, just for those of you that might not be familiar, Network for Good is a nonprofit organization that helps companies and nonprofits to unleash generosity and to advance good causes. And so during times of disaster, we serve as a hub both for individuals as well as nonprofits and companies who are providing disaster giving resources for their customers and employees. And so that's the framework through which I'm providing some of this information. So if you don't mind going forward one slide, that would be great. So going forward, perfect, great. So like I mentioned, Network for Good is all about giving. No surprises, the name of the game with digital donations is disasters in December. So basically people give to charity in mass 2 times a year. One, on the last day of the year, December or the month, but in particular the last couple of days. You'll see with this trend of giving at the end of the year, and in addition during disaster. So the concentrated of giving, where online giving really is the name of the game. For those of you that are familiar with all the trends in the sector, online giving is only really a small portion of overall giving, but that really shifts during disaster, where online and digital and mobile donations represent the majority of the giving during that time of disaster. You can go to the next slide. What's really interesting about when you look at the trends around disaster giving, and sadly, or that I have personally been at Network for Good for every one is disaster, which means you all can't see me, but the gray hair and the wrinkles all come along with that. But again, like I said, what's really interesting about disaster donations is there's a swift peak and as well as a fall. For the most part, they peak within the first 2 to 3 days, and then there's a sharp decline. And what's interesting with some of these disasters, you might be thinking, well, actually the lines look a little bit different. I'll use Japan as an example, but when there's the flow of giving strongly mirrors the news cycle that's happening for any given disaster. So what happens is that there's follow-up news that either the damage is greater than anticipated, or the there's follow-up disasters, post-quake disaster, there's a burst of giving, but then there's additional campaigns like music, television shows, or corporate matching that tend to follow up. But again, at a high level, even if the disaster is big or small, you'll see Oklahoma, the most recent disaster was less than $1 million donations compared to several million in donations for the others. But despite their difference in magnitude, the overall trend is very similar in terms of a peak and then a fall. You can go to the next slide. So no surprises. I'm using Hurricane Sandy as an example because it's probably the most recent, as well as kind of most recent material disaster. And so Hurricane Sandy obviously was local, and so it was top of mind for a lot of people, local meaning domestic. And then here, this is a really good example where there's a peak and a fall and then a follow-up peak. In this instance, at least from our data, and I'm speaking specifically of giving, the follow-up peak really was around companies uniting for additional matching and efforts and campaigns specific for the disaster, but right after it happened. Not to mention, I think, additional news on how there was going to be a need for long-term recovery, and so those are the two things that seem to drive the peaks and falls of the giving specific to Hurricane Sandy. You can go to the next slide. So we often get asked the question, well, who do donors like to support during times of disaster? No surprise, and that's why Jen is on the phone. Most people at a high level support the Red Cross, or the first responders on the ground. Our data has gone, in any given disaster could be different, especially if it's domestic versus international, but anywhere from 60 to 80% of people will choose to support the Red Cross because of all their great work on the ground. In addition, there's kind of the likely responders, organizations like Salvation Army, AmeriCares that look familiar, and then depending on the disaster, there can be, if there's a lot of rebuilding, it could be habitat, if a lot of animals seem to be impacted, people want to be supporting animal organizations, it really depends. But this was the list of top charities for Hurricane Sandy, and to be honest, it doesn't change all that much, given what I mentioned, which is most people support the Red Cross, and then there's basically kind of, I'd say, around typically 5 that get the lion's share of donations. You can go to the next slide. I also wanted to mention a couple of trends, which is, so Network for Good has a unique vantage point where we are processing donations, and again, it goes without saying, I didn't even mention it, but during times of disaster, cash donations is absolutely the very first action that companies might be contemplating, as well as donors, and then comes the organization around service. And so with respect to the giving, we see most of the giving happening through media sites and social good platforms. Why? Media sites are where people are reading compelling news stories about what's going on, and then things like how to help links directly from the news story is when you're emotionally compelled, and putting in a call to action to donate right there is very powerful. Secondarily, the social good platforms are increasingly a more material place where people are actually making contributions. Why? Because that's where the authentic messenger is. That's where somebody who is on the ground is maybe making an appeal, or somebody sharing a story about a friend that needs help. The number one reason people give to an organization is because often they've been asked by a friend or family member. That's why we see overwhelming giving in these two buckets. Just a couple of quick trends specific to Sandy. The average donation was actually higher for Hurricane Sandy. Again, I think it being a domestic disaster played into that. There was more corporate response. I feel like it was everywhere. It was at your bank, your credit card company, and for the first time I feel like we really saw the perfecting of multi-channel, meaning social was driving giving, there was TV, there was radio, it was everywhere you went. The call to action spread very quickly. Next slide. These last two slides I'm going to go through very quickly. I just want to show you an example of companies that are reacting very quickly for disaster. So a company like Yahoo will put a how to help link on their homepage. A company like Capital One, they have a disaster plan that they implement very quickly. Within within less than 24 hours, they're up and running. And the Network for Good actually helps companies do their own pages, which is in the bottom right slide. Next slide, and then my last one. So the last thing I'll say is that it's really imperative, given all the trends that I mentioned. So the peak in the fall, the fact that people want to give in droves online, it's really important to have a plan. And so we really recommend that companies have a disaster relief giving plan that includes things like when to respond and setting the response scope. It's really important to do this because it happens so quickly. You want to be prepared. I hope that everybody on the phone has a disaster relief giving plan, and if you don't, we have a guide that we can provide along with the materials about the steps that you go through to do that. We really encourage people to do that so that you're in a good place to react during the next disaster. That's all I had.
Great. So, Jim, are you on the call? Oh, great.
I'm on the call.
All right.
So what I'd like to talk about is how the Red Cross engages the community in our disaster relief mission, and we'll use Superstorm Sandy as some context to talk about some of the things that we do, some of the new things that we're doing, and some of the things that we'll be doing as we move down the road. So during Superstorm Sandy last fall, you can see some of the level of effort that the Red Cross put forth in just the response effort. I want to highlight a couple of things for you. One is that we mobilized more than 17,000 individuals to support our relief efforts for Superstorm Sandy. What's significant about that number is that over 6,500 of those individuals were not volunteers prior to Sandy. So we had a lot of people that came out to help that had no prior affiliation with our organization. So these are, some people refer to those types of volunteers as spontaneous volunteers. We're actually introducing new nomenclature in our organization and referring to them as event-based volunteers. Part of the reason is, I don't know if the volunteer themselves that decided to show up one day would consider themselves all that spontaneous, but they are individuals who want to help for a particular event, typically have a fairly limited time constraints. They can help out for half a day, maybe just over the weekend, and don't want to spend all their time just getting trained in order to provide that help or assistance. As part of our Sandy relief efforts, we also had over 35 companies provide their employees as volunteers. That was about 1,200 corporate employees that came out to assist us. Most of those, over 1,000 of those, had no prior volunteering relationship with us. So part of our focus and effort is really to find strategies, tactics, and techniques to allow us to embrace the outpouring of goodwill from the communities and the corporate sectors in our disaster response efforts. It does a lot of things for us. The more individuals that we can get from the impacted area to actually help does a lot of things for us. Number one, it gives those folks in that community an opportunity to be a part of their response and their recovery efforts and help make a difference in their own community. It also increases our stewardship to our donors as we're able to decrease our travel and lodging expenses for our volunteers if we're using people from the local area who don't need to be flown in and don't require overnight lodging. In Oklahoma, the tornadoes that struck Moore, Oklahoma, we actually continued our efforts to embrace event-based volunteers and actually had 5,000 individuals sign up, and we were able to put almost 1,500 of those people to work as an event-based volunteer. So the types of things that we had those folks do for us, or actually how we engage our spontaneous volunteers on the next slide, there's really kind of two different ways. One is a typical reactive mode, which we will continue to have, where people reach out and contact us, either by phone, online, or just showing up at one of our service delivery sites or a chapter or volunteer intake center. During Hurricane Sandy, we had about 10,000 people who did that. And as I mentioned, in Oklahoma, we had 5,000 people that actually did that. We're also trying to reach individuals and the public through a variety of different outreach mechanisms and trying to be a little bit more proactive. So we're leveraging our social media strategies, leveraging our online presence, using emails to contact individuals, obviously leveraging the media, and then reaching out to our partner network as well, such as our Ready When the Time Comes corporate partner program. In fact, an example of this is we established during Sandy a landing page on redcross.org targeted to people just in the greater New York metro area, and had over 4,500 people sign up on that page in less than 18 hours. So the demand and willingness to help is always ever present during disasters, particularly ones of significant magnitude. If we can move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what some of these event-based or spontaneous volunteers did. As you can see, they were involved in all aspects of our disaster relief operations, from helping out in shelters, helping us in feeding, some engagement around client casework, used quite a bit of them in our warehouse and logistics, and distributing supplies to those impacted by the disaster, helping man call centers, and also helping with our volunteer intake function. In order for us to take advantage of this outpouring of goodwill, we did have to change our process. We've expedited our application and intake process, and in New York, we just created a shorter form to capture the essential information and modified some of our background check requirements. In Oklahoma, we were actually able to leverage our new volunteer management system that we call Volunteer Connection, and was able to streamline that, and that was a great facilitator for us, and resulted in increased numbers and actually a much shorter processing time to get people to sign up and make themselves known that they wanted to help. We also modified our training. During Sandy, we reduced our shelter training from 8 hours to 3 hours, and also provided some on-the-job training for basic tasks. Going forward, we're actually getting that even streamlined even more, and we'll be able to put a event-based volunteer to work within 30 minutes of them signing up. So what our event-based volunteers told us is, they volunteer because they just want to help their community. That's the number one reason, and it's not something that would surprise anybody. They also enjoy working directly with clients, and if you ask an individual who raises their hand to volunteer what they'd like to do, they will answer that with their own question of, what would you like me to do? Or basically anything that you need done, they're willing to help with. One of the things that we do know that we need to provide is better supervision and direction for folks, especially for those that have had no prior affiliation with the organization. So on the next slide, just list some key bullets of things that we are doing today. We are shifting our focus. We are implementing strategies, changing processes to enable us to better take advantage of our event-based volunteers. Part of that is restructuring our volunteer jobs and actually making them more task-based. So taking the job of a shelter worker and breaking that down into specific tasks, such as helping establish or set up a shelter or tear down a shelter. There are specific tasks that you can train somebody on in less than 30 minutes to provide assistance and help with that. That's just one example of how we're taking jobs and breaking that down into tasks that are more amenable to event-based volunteers who have had no prior training or relationship with the Red Cross. We're also implementing efforts to do more proactive outreach prior to a known event like a hurricane, or outreach, in the aftermath of an unpredicted event like a tornado. One of the things that we are establishing is a new mobile application called Team Red Cross that is targeted to event-based volunteers. In fact, today is its official launch day. You can find it on the iTunes App Store or the Google Play Store. Just search Team Red Cross. And this app is for those individuals who typically would be an event-based volunteer. They don't have the time or perhaps desire to be a full-fledged, regularly trained Red Cross volunteer, but want to help when a disaster strikes. This particular app then provides them some basic information and education about specific tasks we'd ask them to provide, and then allows us to send them a notification when we would need them in a geography in which they're at that particular time. It's also connected to the social network, so it's a great social engagement tool as well. Part of that app is also part of another strategy of being more assertive in setting and managing expectations. People who have had no prior affiliation with the organization, when they show up to volunteer, they typically will come with their own picture in their mind about what that's going to be like, or if they may have no expectation. Most people come with some preconceived notion about what their engagement is going to be. We need to do a better job of helping set and manage that so they do know what they're walking into when they show up to volunteer on a disaster relief operation. And we're changing our intake processes so that we're able to get someone at what we call door to floor in 30 minutes. So when someone arrives and says, hey, I'd like to help, if we've got an assignment for them, we can get them through our intake process and trained and ready to help within 30 minutes. So some of that will happen. We've got reformatting our training to be online, using mobile platforms and other tools that can get that information and education to people quickly and in a format that's easy for them to digest. And then we're also doing training with our own volunteers and employees on engaging these event-based volunteers. So those are some of the strategies that we have in place. We were able to actually test a few of these things out in Oklahoma, and we're able to get more event-based volunteers on a percentage basis deployed and actively part of our operations in a more successful manner in Oklahoma from Sandy, and we'll continue to make improvements around that. So with that, I will turn things back to Lauren for James.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, James.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for being here. So my part of the presentation will really be around Microsoft's corporate response to disasters, because we are obviously not a disaster relief organization, but we have a long history with disaster relief efforts, and so the way we do that really is through engaging folks, partners, employees, etc. So I'm just going to kind of walk through how we react when a disaster happens and the different channels in which we use to engage our different stakeholders. So if you can flip on to the next slide here. Yeah, so the first place we really go to is the community, right? So, and there's a lot of different images on this slide, so don't try and read all the little fine print on each one of them. But on the far left there, that is a HelpBridge app that we created, and it's a user app. It's on Windows, iOS, and Android. It's for free, and it helps people connect with friends and family during an emergency. You can quickly send an "I need help" or "I'm okay" message across Facebook, SMS, email, and Twitter is rolling out right now. It's actually out in the marketplace, in the Windows marketplace, and soon coming to iOS and Android, as well as connecting the user with ways to get involved and help. You can see there's ways to text to give, donate larger amounts, donate goods, and then volunteer. So this is one way in which we have created a piece of technology that really allows users to engage with their family and friends, as well as engage with nonprofits out there that are helping out. And speaking of nonprofits, that whole list in the middle there, the icons of different nonprofits. You can see NetHope, CARE, Aid Matrix, etc. These are some of our key strategic nonprofit partners that we reach out to during a time of disaster, because we can have a much larger impact by working with our partners than by trying to do things ourselves. This core group here are some of the world-leading nonprofit organizations that get involved when a disaster strikes, and so we really try and partner with the experts to with either by sending our volunteers that way, by sending cash, by sending technology support, to really make sure that we can help their relief efforts as much as possible. And then the webpage screenshot on the right there, that's just ways that we talk to our customers. So whenever a disaster strikes, we actually launch a specific web page about that disaster. So for Hurricane Sandy, for example, or any of the larger disasters, what we've done is we create a web page immediately that contains information about the disaster. Not necessarily information about what Microsoft is doing, but it provides links to relevant information through FEMA, American Red Cross, others, information about the storm if it's still happening, information about how people can get involved and how they can help. We try to include some mapping capabilities as well in there. Just it's more of an information portal for our customers than anything that really talks about what Microsoft does. And then on the right there, you can see some additional web properties we use. We use social media, obviously Twitter, Facebook, as well as our own Microsoft Citizenship website and blog and all of that. So when a disaster strikes, we really reach out to the community in a number of different ways, to everything from end users to nonprofits to Microsoft stakeholders and customers, to really help spread the word and encourage folks to get involved in helping with disaster relief efforts. So in the next slide, you'll see how we then engage with our employees. So Microsoft, and you can go ahead and click through and let the animation roll there. Our employees are very engaged. We have 90,000 employees around the world, basically, and they are very active and engaged employees when it comes to philanthropy, whether it's their time and their money, for a variety of different reasons. So what we really like to do is, when a disaster strikes, is to make sure that our employees understand ways that they can get involved and help. And we do that in a number of different ways. Through internal websites, we have websites where employees know to go to look for news and information about different things. We use social media, not only the outward-facing Twitter and Facebook, but we also use Yammer, which is an internal kind of corporate social media technology that we use inside to talk to each other as employees. And so we really use that social media as well. Obviously, email, all of the employees are on email, and so we reach out via email about ways that people can get involved. And then we also do a couple of other things. We have every new employee has to go through a new employee orientation. And during that time, we talk about, there's a whole section about how employees can get engaged and help out, not just in terms of disasters, but just in general, what the benefits are to them in terms of any matching for hours donated and money donated, and just ways that they can get involved. And then, of course, every year we have our annual giving campaign, where it goes for the month of October, where we really encourage employees to get involved in philanthropic activities, and that's when we talk about all the disaster relief activities that we've been up to and stuff throughout the year as well. And just an example of that, for Hurricane Sandy, and this data might be a little old. I haven't pulled it recently, so there could be some updated information. But essentially, employees gave $1.5 million, including Microsoft Match, for Hurricane Sandy relief efforts. That's just from our employees. That's not from Microsoft. We gave some additional funds and additional support as needed to relief organizations, but that's just coming from our employees. And so our employees really love to get involved and help out however and whenever they can. So that's kind of how we engage the communities, how we engage the employees. And then on the next slide, we also then work very closely with our subsidiaries. So I mentioned Microsoft has 90,000 employees around the world, and so in various cities and countries we have subsidiary offices. And a lot of times what we found is that we can be most effective in delivering relief and helping organizations by really working from that local subsidiary level and less from a corporate level. So for example, the Boston tragedy. there were a lot of local donations, local partnerships, local events that went on in Boston through our local subsidiary that really helped provide immediate and quick relief. The people in those areas, they know who the relevant people are, who the relevant organizations are, and so we really encourage and allow local subsidiaries a lot of leeway in terms of how they get engaged and when they get engaged and with whom they get engaged around a disaster, because they're the experts on the ground. They can start providing relief very quickly and efficiently, more so than we could at a centralized corp level. And another example is the China earthquake that just happened a few months ago, actually. Again, it's our local offices there could really get involved quickly with local partners and facilitating local donations more quickly than we could from a corporate level. And so they really got involved to provide relief and support as much as needed, both technology as well as cash and volunteer hours to help with the China earthquake that was going on. And so there are some times when the disaster is so big and so it's so devastating that we need a centralized corporate response. But then there are other times when the events are much more localized, where we can actually deliver more effective relief support via our local subsidiaries than we can from a corporate standpoint. And then I think there's one more slide, I believe. Yes, and then our employees as well. So I mentioned earlier about how we share information with our employees and try to encourage them to get involved. But we also encourage our employees to, take the initiative and create programs and create ways for employees and others to get involved in, around disaster relief, where they can have a big impact without needing a corporate, kind of a centralized corporate push to make that happen. One example is the Japan earthquake and tsunami several years back now. We have not only do we have a lot of employees in Japan who were impacted, but we have a lot of employees here at our corporate office who have friends, family, colleagues back in Japan as well. So it was a big emphasis here from the employees, a lot of employee-led initiatives where they actually created their own mini group within Microsoft, and they put on all kinds of events. They put on a fun run. They put on matching gift donations. They ran all kinds of campaigns inside the company for employees and put on all kinds of events. And they raised, just from this group and just with their efforts, over $1 million, including Microsoft Match, all driven by employees. This is an entirely employee-led initiative. And similarly, with that same disaster, but later on, there were several villages that are primarily fishing villages that just got completely wiped out. Not only were all their boats gone, but their fishing sheds and all their equipment. So not only were they having to deal with the impact of the actual earthquake and tsunami, but then their livelihoods are totally wiped out and gone. So our employees then started, with connections to local villages there, started to identify ways in which we can actually have immediate help and an immediate impact. And one way was partnering with Peace Winds America. Employees started raising money to actually buy fishing sheds, since they all got destroyed during the earthquake and tsunami. This is kind of the first step to allow the fishermen to kind of get back to work and start trying to bring in money for their families. And so they started at the time that I originally created this slide. They'd raised $29,000 and they'd purchased a bunch of sheds already, and they were still collecting more and more and more money to purchase as many sheds as possible for these fishing villages that were just completely destroyed. Again, completely employee-led initiative. It didn't have any kind of direction from the subsidiary, no corporate direction. This is just employees. So when a disaster strikes, we really find it useful to engage with a bunch of different stakeholders to have as big of an impact as possible. And depending on the size and the impact of the disaster, we find that different partnerships and different engagements are actually more effective than others. And I'm just going to kind of echo back to something Stacy said at the beginning of the presentation. And one way that we kind of have this all outlined is we have a plan, a disaster response handbook that we have here at Microsoft that we developed that really outlines kind of, when a disaster strikes, how does Microsoft get involved? And what are the ways in which we get involved, what are the ways that our employees can get involved, and it really kind of walks through the process by which we respond to a disaster. Everything from what's our communications process and cadence, who do we communicate to, how do we communicate, to when do we set up group calls, how do we engage with nonprofits, how do we engage with employees, how do we engage with subsidiaries, and it really kind of walks through all of this, so that way when a disaster strikes, we don't have to spend valuable time trying to figure all of this out. It's all really laid out there for us, and we just turn to that playbook as at least guidance, to help us respond to the different disasters. So that's really how Microsoft engages with its different stakeholders, internal and external, to really help support disaster relief efforts that are going on. I think that might be my last slide. Yes, it is.
Great. Thank you so much, James. So just a reminder to everybody, as we move into the question and answer portion of the session this morning, you can still continue to ask your questions by typing them into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and also submitting them via Twitter by tweeting your questions to @VM_solutions using the hashtag VMBPN. And so we've been kind of going through the questions that have been coming in, and my colleague Vicki Hush has been putting some of those together, so I'm going to hand things over to her to pose some questions to you guys.
Great, thank you. This one is actually for Jim with the Red Cross, and I think what was interesting is just learning how the American Red Cross has started really tapping into those event-based volunteers. And at VolunteerMatch, we certainly see a big outcry for volunteers who are interested in helping when a disaster strikes, but often there aren't projects for them if they're not already trained and on the ground and ready to go. So I'm curious, there's a good mix of corporations and nonprofits on the call today. I'm curious, Jim, if you can just talk through some of the process internally at the Red Cross about how to shift to really kind of change the door-to-floor timing for those event-based volunteers to help other organizations on the call think through how they can be doing that.
Sure thing. And let me preface my remarks by stating that while we want to engage many more event-based volunteers in our work, my hypothesis is that we will always have more people that want to help than we have work for people. But if we can get more of those people engaged, I think we're going to be in a much better position. The community is going to be in a much better position for the recovery as well. So in terms of some of the things that we are looking and are changing to be much more inclusive with our event-based volunteers, there's really two major buckets that we're addressing. One is basically our procedures and our processes, and making them much more amenable to engaging somebody for a very short time period, be it a half day, a day, maybe over a weekend. And that involves taking our work, which we've defined into jobs that we have volunteers do, that involves multiple different types of things and requires a longer set of training and certification and et cetera, et cetera. We're taking some of those jobs and we're breaking those down into specific tasks. I gave you an example with shelter operations, and we can train a volunteer to set up cots in less than a minute. Where before we'd have to train someone to be a shelter worker, that would just be one component of it. We can provide the necessary education that someone needs to assist with damage assessment in a fairly short time period. So we're in the process now of actually breaking down some of those. We've already identified about a half dozen common tasks that we can ask and have event-based volunteers do, and are building job aids, training tools, things of that nature. So getting them in a position to be ready to actually help is one of the areas. The other thing that we're doing is streamlining our intake process that has been facilitated a great deal with our new volunteer management system called Volunteer Connection. It is basically our system that we use to get someone to sign up to volunteer and move them through the process. Most of that is automated, is done online, and so it can happen as quick as we can have individuals move through that process. So that's facilitated that quite a bit, and we saw the impact of that in Oklahoma. It allows us to capture that information quickly. It also allows us to communicate to right back to people who have expressed an interest. So one of the goals that we want to have as part of our outreach to event-based volunteers is I don't want someone to sign up and say they never heard anything from us. And in Oklahoma, we were actually able to send every single individual that signed up a message acknowledging their offer of help and a message that we'd get back to them when we needed them. So those are just some examples of some of the kind of process and procedure things that we're changing, which will facilitate a great deal our ability to engage more event-based volunteers. The other set or other area that we're focusing on is shifting our culture to be more welcoming and embracing event-based volunteers. And that speaks to the need to have our own leadership and our own volunteers welcome the value that event-based volunteers can bring to a disaster relief operation. Those of you familiar with the Red Cross know that our historical practice has been with our volunteers is we provide them a great deal of training. We look for a 3-week commitment from them when they deploy to disasters, and they're used to seeing other individuals that have made that same level of commitment. When we bring in event-based volunteers, we're introducing new volunteers who have had no prior affiliation and very limited training on a particular job, but have enough education to do a task for us. And it's individuals that will be with us half day, maybe a day, things of that nature. And we want those people to feel valued and appreciated as well. And that means we need our own people and our own volunteers to be embracing those. It also means introducing a new skill set for our supervisors in providing supervision to a new group of people every day. Where our supervisors today, can usually count on a team or having a team in place for a week, 2 weeks, maybe even up to 3 weeks. In the world of using event-based volunteers for particular tasks, we may have a supervisor that has a new team every single day, meaning that they're going to have to repeat a lot of the same basic information to a group of new people every single day as well. So there's some training that we'll be doing and are getting ready to launch for our own people on how to embrace our event-based volunteers, making them feel valued, how to deliver training in a very quick and effective way that's very task-focused and leveraging our tools. So policies and procedures and then culture are the 2 areas that we're addressing.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. So the next question is sort of split for James and Stacy. And both of you talked about sort of kits or planning handouts that you have available. Stacey, I know that Network for Good has one on just disaster planning that's a good kickoff for companies to take a look at. And then, James, you mentioned your disaster planning handbook. I'm wondering if both of you could pull the top 2 things that you think are important for people to know about what's in them and share that. And then also everyone on the call is clamoring to make sure that they might be able to take a peek at the actual handbook. So wondering if you're willing to share them.
I'll take the first part.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I'll take the first part. So, yes, we have an entire guide and, frankly, an effort around this, which is making sure companies have their own plan. So I think that I'm going to pick 3 of the most important things. One is to have a plan. It doesn't need to be the most detailed thing. It probably doesn't need to be nearly as detailed as James's plan. But just put something to paper that says what you do during a disaster and why would you do this, because inevitably somebody's out of town, the person, we all have our time constraints. It's really important to put something to paper, and it can be as detailed or as high level as you want, but create a plan. If you're going to do that, I think the 2 most important things of that plan are deciding when to respond. So what are the criteria? And again, all disasters might have some aspect of an ad hoc nature in terms of when to respond, but things like national or international, is it of high importance to your company, or is it happen in your footprint? Is there significant media coverage? Those are the types of things that go into deciding when to respond. And then the second thing is setting the response scope, which is to what extent. Are you going to have a letter from the CEO? Are you going to enable donations? Are you going to encourage people to volunteer? What is that? And I'd say that those are really the biggest things to decide. There's additional things that are important, but if I had to whittle it down. And then lastly, yes, my offer stands, one, to make sure that our e-guide that goes through all these steps is available, and absolutely happy to help anybody on the phone think through this for your own company.
Yeah, and then just to kind of echo a little bit of what Stacy said, from the Microsoft Disaster Response Handbook, there was really two things that I think are most important. One is we're very specific about when we get involved, because there are any number of disasters happening around the world on any given day, and as a corporation, you know, our primary responsibility and our primary goals as a company are not around disaster response. While we do have a big effort around disaster relief opportunities, and we try to encourage participation in those, and we try and support them as much as possible, you know, we're not a disaster relief company. So we are very specific about what types of disasters we respond to and how we respond to them. So, for example, a minor flooding, you know, in a certain area, we might respond one way versus a catastrophic earthquake in an area that impacts millions of people. We probably respond in another way. And so we just have that kind of clearly laid out in our handbook, just so that we know how to respond to the different disasters that happen. And then second, and at least this one I find is most important for communicating with employees, because as soon as a disaster strikes, you know, employees start emailing me and emailing others in the company asking, you know, what are we doing, how do we get involved, all of that. So we have a pretty detailed communications plan built out, so that when a disaster strikes, you know, within X amount of time, we send this communication to, you know, senior leadership, to the employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that way we are more proactive in our communications to our employees who care about what's going on than waiting for them to respond to us. And so we've got all of that pretty laid out in our handbook, which just helps reduce the amount of spin and the amount of chaos that can happen when a disaster strikes, because it's confusing and chaotic anyway. You know, having at least some guidelines in place helps. And I agree with Stacy that your plan doesn't need to be, you know, 400 pages in a book and robust and detail out everything. Even just getting something basic in place to start out with is a great idea. And in terms of allowing a sneak peek at our handbook, I'm not really sure I can do that. I think that there's some. I'm not really sure that I can make that public, but I do suggest using the resources that Network for Good has, and I will double check on what I can share out of the Microsoft handbook.
Great, thanks. I had to ask because there's been a lot of questions coming up. And then just as a follow-up, James, so as part of your planning, do you have, you know, once you hear of a disaster and you know kind of how Microsoft is going to participate, do you have caps on the giving or sort of time that's allotted for people to get involved, or is it really more just about facilitating things and seeing how you can support, and it just varies on a case-by-case basis for a particular disaster?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have any caps or any kind of limitations on how employees can get involved. I mean, you know, in our own minds, we have you know, rough ballparks as to how Microsoft will respond to a disaster. So I guess from that perspective, we have you know, ideas on how we respond, like I said, to like a minor flood versus a catastrophic earthquake, but I wouldn't say that there's any kind of cap associated with each one of those. It's whatever is kind of appropriate at the time just seems to make sense. And in terms of our employees, yeah, we don't restrict how they can get involved or when they can get involved at all. Like, for example, if an employee right now wanted to make a donation to some organization, you know, providing aid with regards to, you know, Japan earthquake and tsunami, because there's still stuff going on there, like, great, good on them. We would encourage that. Microsoft would match their donation. We don't, you know, they can give to that even this many years later. So we don't put any kind of caps or restrictions on that at all. It's just more guidelines around the scope of the disaster and how we get involved. So it's more guidelines, but no caps or restrictions on how employees can get involved.
Great. And then another question, you know, there's sort of a theme that each of you, you know, obviously technology plays a big part now just on how people are able to get involved with disasters, and you know, Network for Good, and it sounds like Red Cross has the new app for the event-based volunteers, and then of course with HelpBridge. I'm just curious, you know, just how you've seen those play a role and sort of shift the conversation around disasters. Is it really just that it's obviously more available for people and easier for people to get involved, or have you seen any other interesting trends kind of with how technology has engaged your potential volunteers or donors, and it's sort of an open question for any of you.
Well, I'll take this. Go ahead, Stacy.
I'll just take a quick stab, and then I'll turn it over to you. We've seen two things. One is a proliferation of places to give. And so back in the day, again, back in the early days of Network for Good, back in kind of 04 mode, everybody was giving through websites. So it was back in the days of portals. Everybody went to a website to give. And a lot of people came to Network for Good's website. Now we're seeing giving happening every place else where people are hanging out online, either digitally or via mobile. And so that's one definite trend. And those, as you saw from the data that we shared, they're material contributors to the volume of donation. So that's one. The second thing we're seeing is that, no surprise, people want to move seamlessly across devices. And so that's really forced us as an organization that serves technology to companies and nonprofits to make sure the solutions that we're providing render nicely no matter how you might be visiting them. And so we did a lot of work to make sure all of our solutions have a mobile web component, which means if you access them from the desktop, they look one way. If you access them from a smartphone or tablet, they redirect. We have code that allows the experience to change, and so that it's equally compelling no matter how you're accessing it. And again, a good example of that is we offer the technology to Microsoft so that they could have a very slick user experience in terms of their app and allowing people to make contributions from a smartphone.
Stacy, thanks. So at the Red Cross, we've been leveraging technology more and more aggressively each passing year. I think the biggest impact that we've seen with technology is, as Stacy had mentioned, in the fundraising arena with text-to-donate campaigns, particularly in Haiti, and continues to be a successful fundraising tool for us. And then building that out into the app world. And so with the launch of our apps with preparedness apps around first aid, hurricanes, tornadoes, seeing a lot of adoption of those apps in particular. We also have been using technology in the social media space just to stay on top of information, what people are saying, use it as a way to disseminate additional information, get information, and in fact we have a core of volunteers who we call our digi-volunteers who actually help us with that, particularly during times of major disasters. We're just now introducing more and more technology into the volunteering space with the implementation of our new volunteer management system, which will also have a mobile application of it in the coming months, and then with the new app. So I think in the volunteering space it is too soon to tell, but based on our prior experiences in these other areas and what we've seen so far just with the volunteer connection system, we expect this to be a great enabler for us as a way to get, one, just more people engaged and involved, but also to allow more people to feel engaged and involved as well.
Great, thank you. And then a quick question, we probably have time for one or two more questions for James. Curious if you have sort of a defined associate-to-associate program where, you know, if there are employees in an area that's been affected by a disaster, can other employees donate through the foundation and that then gets dispersed to those employees, something that's sort of really about helping colleagues?
No, we don't actually. That's a good question, but no, we don't really have any kind of way to enable that. We don't have any kind of program in place or anything like that.
Okay, so it does sound like you've got some grassroots things that are at least spurred by employees. So yeah.
Most definitely, yeah. Our employees on the ground wherever disaster strikes, you know, are almost immediately engaged with local partners and local relief efforts and stuff. So, you know, that's kind of how we just manage our any kind of local engagements.
Okay, great. And then there was another question just around. I didn't catch it, but you may have said it, James. Whether you all have a sort of multiple days for volunteering for disaster. A couple of the companies that we work with have that, where, you know, typically they may have a half day or 1 day volunteering sort of time off program, but in a time of disaster they up that to a week where an employee can go and travel and be on the ground. So I'm curious if Microsoft has anything like that. And I'm also curious from Jim if you see that at the Red Cross where there are employees showing up for a longer period of time to really dig in and help the Red Cross in a place of disaster.
Yeah, we don't have any kind of time off benefits around volunteering for employees, at least in the U.S. Internationally, depending on the location, employees can get up to 3 days, to volunteer however they want. It's not necessarily disaster related. And then in the U.S., we don't have any time off, but we do, anytime an employee volunteers with any place, as long as they volunteer up to 10 hours, Microsoft will match every hour with $17 towards that nonprofit. So, for example, if I worked 10 hours with the American Red Cross, if I volunteered, Microsoft would donate $170 to the American Red Cross, just matching my volunteer hours. So that's kind of the only volunteer benefit we have. But I can say that when a disaster strikes, I would say most areas within inside Microsoft are pretty flexible in terms of vacation. And if an employee wanted to take off for a week to travel to New York, for example, to help out with the Superstorm Sandy relief efforts when it was happening, odds are that would be allowed, and then their time there being spent volunteering with the organization would then also be matched by Microsoft. So we don't really have any explicit days off, but we have just a general volunteer matching program.
Great.
With respect to what we're seeing from a employee engagement standpoint as it relates to disaster relief operations, most of our corporate employees who volunteer typically do so in short time periods, a day, maybe the weekend, things of that nature, rather than more prolonged or extended periods of engagement. There are exceptions to that. We have a program with our corporate partners called Ready When the Time Comes, and several of those partners actually do provide small teams of their employees for extended periods. JetBlue is a great example, a great partner of ours, who are always deploying a group of employees as part of our disaster relief efforts, and more than just for a day or two. So, I would say that most, it's typically what we've seen is kind of more defined around, we can provide a team of 10 people to help out for a day, and more, I guess, what we'll call project-based kinds of things.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all the questions that came in from the audience, and thank you to Vicki for managing the Q&A session, and to our speakers for the wonderful answers. I think we're just about running out of time here, so I wanted to wrap things up with just a few updates from VolunteerMatch. So in addition to these webinars that we do monthly, we also have a number of other ways that everybody can stay up to date and informed with what's going on in the world of volunteering and corporate social responsibility. So you can visit us on the web on our blog at volunteering@csr.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at @VM_solutions. And I would also encourage everybody on the call to sign up for our monthly Good Companies newsletter, which you can sign up for on the blog as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is that our next webinar coming up on September 10th, so everybody save the date for that. We're going to be joined by Liz Ma, the CEO of Net Impact, who's going to be sharing with us some findings from the What Workers Want report, and talking to us about how we can prepare as a company to engage the next generation of workers, which are the millennials. So you'll be able to register for that now, and whenever I send out all of the follow-up materials after the event, the recorded webinar and the presentation here, you'll be able to go ahead and get registered for that next webinar. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us on the call. And Stacy, Jim, and James, thank you so much for doing this presentation with us this morning and sharing your insights with everybody. We really appreciate it. So everybody have a great day, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.